message of the gospel is powerful and life-changing, but it's not always well received. In fact, many people conclude it's rather, silly. Today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg compares two types of wisdom, that of the world and that of the Word. Alistair is in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 today as we continue our series called Firm Foundation, Volume 1.
Paul says the message of the cross is being preached. And when it is preached, those who listen are divided into two groups, supremely so. In one group are those who are being saved as a result of their faith and trust in that message which has been proclaimed. And in the other group, it comprises those who are perishing. The word for perishing means literally perishing, wasting away, but with the added connotation that the wasting process will never finally reach a conclusion. It is a perishing which will go on right into eternity, which disintegrates man at the level of his psyche, at the level of his body, in physical terms, in spiritual terms, and it will be a disintegration process which never finally comes to an end, so that there will be no quenching of the thirsty tongue. There will be no solace for the lonely heart. And the perishing element will be a ghastly thing to contend with. Now, despite the fact that men and women this morning are prepared to acknowledge that in physical terms we live in a perishing community, because we look in the mirror and we realize we just don't look as good as we did yesterday. People bring out old photograph albums and let us know that we are aging even though we may not acknowledge it to be the case. And we know in a micro perspective that the putrefying process of life has already set in, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Far more significant, says Paul, is the fact that men and women, what they recognize in the physical realm is true in the spiritual realm. And unless by grace through faith the process of decay is arrested, perishing will be their ultimate destiny. And so he says, let us make sure that when we are proclaiming the gospel, that we are doing so in a way that recognizes what our priority must be. Men and women are prepared to embrace what we have to say as long as it seems eminently sensible to them. But as it was in the city of Corinth, so it is in Cleveland today, that when you distill the essence of the gospel message, the message of the cross, people frankly say that is nuts. And in the Corinthian context, with all of its wisdom, with all of its wealth, with all of its arts, with all of its Olympian athletes, with all that was on offer for the average family as they moved around the city in that first century context, the notion that this little converted Jew, with his brusque manner and his blunt message, had something to say that was worth listening to was really just a joke to them. They had no notion that he was anything other than a figure of fun, somebody to be laughed at and to be ridiculed, rather than someone to be listened to and respected. Despite that truth, throughout the ensuing 2,000 years, the Church of Jesus Christ has scrambled for respectability. And those who have been the exponents of the truth of Jesus Christ, clergymen so-called, have scrambled for the same measure of respectability. And so it is that in the climate of our day, it is fairly comfortable and obvious that people are accorded a certain standard of acceptance, even in a degenerating spiritual context such as ours. We are a long way removed from the apostolic context, whereby Paul arrived in Iconium and in Lystra and in Derbe, not going on the local news channels, not driving into town under banner headlines which read, "We welcome the mighty apostle," but rather coming in as a figure of triviality, proclaiming a message that was obscure, doing it in a way that people thought was stupid, and very often ending bloodied and beaten, lying on the outskirts of the town. And so it is that we have, in our quest for respectability, in our longing for relevance, made ourselves patently irrelevant in a world that has decided that our message is absolutely daft. Because no matter how well we marshal our apologetic arguments, no matter how good we are at trying to justify our spiritual existence to those who are intellectually erudite, the fact is, loved ones, this morning, that when we get to the very heart of it all, our neighbors and our friends simply cannot, simply refuse to make sense of a crucified Christ. It is, says Paul, the message of the cross, foolishness to those who are perishing. Now this is not something new, and so he quotes from the Old Testament, from Isaiah 29, and if you have a minute you could turn over to it and just look at it. Isaiah 29 and verse 14 is the substance of his quote. And Paul is pointing out that God's way has stood in marked contrast to man's way from all of time. And when you come back to this section in Isaiah, we don't have time to dwell on it, you will discover that it is describing a context, 8 centuries BC, in the kingdom of Judah, where people were thinking and planning and acting in a way which effectively said, God is not a reality, and therefore God is irrelevant. And so you will notice that it was within a framework of worship that this was going on. It wasn't that these people had become totally secular. No, they were still showing up at the worship services. It wasn't that they didn't sing the hymns. They were still singing the hymns. It wasn't that they didn't pay attention to what the prophet was saying. They listened. And for all intents and purposes, if anybody were observing them simply from an external perspective, they would have said, there's a group of people who are really embracing the message. But listen to what God says. Verse 13. These people come near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is only made up of rules taught by men. There's no heart in it. They're only coming because somebody said, you've got to come. And so they obeyed, but they weren't happy. And so God says, therefore, once more, as I've done before, I will astound these people with wonder upon wonder. The wisdom of the wise will perish, there's your word, and the intelligence of the intelligent will vanish. I'm going to blow it away, he says. And then one of these great woe passages. Woe to those who go to great depths to hide their plans from the Lord, who do their work in darkness and think, who sees us? Who will know? Isn't that the way children think? When their parents told them, I don't want you to take any of this at all. I baked it. I'm coming back for it. I know it's there, and I expect it to be there when I come back. And then they leave. And then in the mind of the child, they begin to go through this process of thought. Well, I bet she doesn't know how many are there. She was busy, she couldn't have counted. And after all, there's no one here now. Let me just close both of these doors. No one sees, no one will know. And so apparently no one sees and no one knows, and mother comes home and she apparently doesn't see and she apparently doesn't know, and so the child is home scot-free, isn't she? Isn't he? No, because when they lie in their bed in the evening, they have a sneaking suspicion that somebody saw. Somebody saw. But they don't know who it was, and they can't quite work it out. And the guilt within their heart rises within them. They know that someone saw. God saw. And so they face that great crossroads in their lives whereby the possibility of confession and forgiveness is there. But if they choose not to confess and not to be forgiven, then they repress their guilt and they continue in that process. It will become a pattern of their lives. And they will continue to look for places in the darkness where they can do their deeds, because after all, they say to themselves, who sees us? Who will know? The young couple, knowing what the Bible teaches about premarital sex, run off into the darkness some night and in a wooded area with misted up windows in the car, convince themselves, who sees? Who knows? Loved ones, That's the way man thinks. And guess what? God knows that. And He sees. And He knows. And He confounds that kind of thinking. He blows it away. He frustrates the intelligence of the intelligent, and He makes man realize his own puny mentality on things. Look at what he goes on to say. You turn things upside down as if the potter were thought to be like the clay? That's stupid. Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, He did not make me? Do you remember the first time in art class you got to do that, make a thumb pot? You weren't allowed on the wheel yet, which was really good thinking on the part of the art teacher, because when you finally got on it, he realized it was a major mistake. And you got that baby going with pressing those pedals underneath, and it was going faster than the speed of light, and clay was going everywhere off the wall. So he shouted, "Stop and get out!" A little bit of biographical detail there, sorry, just creeping in. I remember his name, it was Mr. Lumsden. But you brought that thing home, an ugly-looking piece of work, if you were honest. Your mother said it was great. She stuck a daffodil in it to try and dress it up. You remember how once you'd put it up on the mantel shelf, it started to call out as you ate your dinner? It started to call out, "You didn't make me, I made myself." No, it didn't, because it couldn't. That's a stupid idea, isn't it? That's a silly idea. That a pot crafted by the hand of man would stand up and say, "I made myself." That's a daft idea. Do you want to hear an even crazier idea? That modern man would stand up and thumb his nose at God and say, "Hey, I made myself. Get out of here." Can the pot say to the potter, "He knows nothing"? So Paul, quoting the Old Testament, makes it perfectly plain that God's wisdom and His way of reckoning is vastly different. And the people 2,800 years ago in Isaiah's day walked around with a smirk all over their faces, relying on human ingenuity and human resourcefulness. So what has changed, I ask you, in 2,800 years? Men and women still today are walking around with a smirk on their faces, relying on human ingenuity and human resources. Even people who are within the framework of the church, and that's the reason Paul is writing this. He's not simply talking about something that's going on outside, he's talking about a problem that's going on inside. That's why he's saying these things. You expect the world in its foolishness to act this way, but you don't expect the church to act this way, do you? You don't expect the church to rely on itself, to rely on the personalities that God has given as gifted people. You don't expect that. But you see, the way of the cross